Now, I wish I could stand up here and tell you that, the way to solve every creative problem is to take a hot shower, play some ping pong, relax, go on vacation. That would be wonderful. But I think we all know that that'd be pretty shoddy advice, that alpha waves aren't a universal cure, and relaxation won't solve every problem. As Nietzsche famously observed, creators have a vested interest in our believing in the flash of revelation, the so-called inspiration shining down from heavens as a ray of grace. In reality, however, the imagination of the good artist or thinker produces continuously good, mediocre, or bad things, but his judgment, trained and sharpened to a fine point, rejects, selects, connects. All great artists and thinkers are great workers. To illustrate his point, Nietzsche described Beethoven's musical notebooks, which documented the composer's painstaking process of refining his melodies. It wasn't uncommon for Beethoven to experiment with 70 different versions of a phrase before settling on the final one. "I make many changes and reject and try again until I'm satisfied," the composer remarked to a friend. In other words, even Beethoven, this cliché of artistic genius, even Beethoven needed to constantly refine his ideas, struggling with his music until the beauty shone through. Let's not sugarcoat this rejecting process, the process described by Nietzsche and Beethoven and experienced by so many artists and tinkerers and inventors ever since. It's not fun. It's the red pen on the page and the discarded sketch, the trashed prototype and the failed first draft. It's ruminating at midnight and tinkering in the lab until the product is perfect. Nevertheless, such a merciless process is sometimes the only way forward. We keep on thinking and paying attention because our next thought might be the answer. So what defines this kind of creativity? What allows us to work hard like Beethoven? It turns out, I would argue, to be largely defined by a new character trait called grit. When you look at people on the far right side of the bell curve, those people, those epic creators like Bob Dylan, Pablo Picasso, and Steve Jobs, what you find is that they're not smarter than the rest of us. If you give them an IQ test, they score well within the range of normal. They look perfectly ordinary. When you give them a battery of personality tests, Myers-Briggs and all the rest, what you find is that they also look pretty ordinary. They may be a little bit more open to experience, but that's about it. But I would argue that really what defines them is that they've got higher levels of grit. Like J.K. Rowling, who suffered through 12 rejections from publishers but kept on writing about Harry Potter in a coffee shop while her baby daughter napped. These productive creators, these people who have achieved high levels of creative achievement in the real world, they're more stubborn and persistent. They refuse to quit. Now, the best way to explain the importance of grit is to tell you a story about supermarket cashiers. This was research done by Paul Sackett. In 1980, he's now a psychologist at the University of Minnesota. And in 1982, he was approached by a large supermarket company to find a way to measure the speed of their cashiers. Who's the fastest at the checkout line? Who's got the best hand-eye coordination? Who can scan those items the quickest? Sackett thought about this, realized, this is a pretty trivial problem. He decided to give everyone 100 items and then see how many of those items they could check out in 5 minutes. So this is called the maximal test. You assume peak motivation. People really want to go fast, and you want to see what they're capable of. So Sackett gave this test to several hundred supermarket cashiers, and sure enough, what he found is that some cashiers are much faster than others. They can check out a lot more items in those 5 minutes. Produces a bell curve of human performance, turns over his data, says, look, I have found your fast cashiers and your slow cashiers. Work here is done. But Sackett keeps on thinking about this problem. He realized that about this time, the supermarkets are introducing electronic scanners. And Sackett realizes that if he got access to those scanners, that he would be able to, without having to give anyone a test, measure their performance, see who was the fastest over the course of a day or a week or a month. So Sackett eventually gets access to the data, and sure enough, he gets another bell curve of human performance where some cashiers are much faster than others. And then Sackett has the bright idea to look to see if these two bell curves of performance are correlated, to see if his maximal test, how people did on this 5-minute test of cashier speed, to see how that compared to his measure of typical performance, how these cashiers did, how fast they were going, how many items they checked out, how many customers they checked out, when they didn't think anyone was even watching. And what he discovered is that the correlation was essentially zero, that it was statistically insignificant, that there was virtually no relationship between his maximal test and his measure of typical performance. That some of the fastest cashiers in that 5-minute test of cashier speed were some of the slowest cashiers, as measured by the electronic scanners, because they took long cigarette breaks, they were too chatty with customers, and so on. That the maximal test had failed to predict typical performance. This is now called the typical maximal distinction, and I would argue it's a pretty important problem. And this is in large part because we live in a world obsessed with maximal tests. From the IQ test to the SAT, we believe that the best way to identify someone's talent, their potential, whether it's as an engineer or a lawyer or an investment banker or an inventor, is to give them a short test and see what they can do, see what they're capable of when they know they're being tested. You control for motivation and you just want to see, I'm just going to measure your talent here. But time and time again, these maximal tests often fail to deliver. They fail to predict what really matters, which is typical performance. My favorite example of just how these maximal tests failure comes from the NFL Combine. So the NFL Combine is, when every player entering the draft has to undergo this battery of maximal tests for 2 days. They do the 40-yard dash, the bench press, vertical leap. They take a short version of the IQ test called a Wonderlic. The assumption of the NFL teams, of course, is that how you perform on all these maximal tests will help them predict your typical performance in the NFL, right? That's why players who do really well at the Combine, they go higher in the draft. But last year, 2 economists at the University of Utah surveyed all the Combine data, compared it to the actual performance in the pros, and what they discovered is that all these maximal tests were useless, that the NFL Combine was a complete waste of time and money. The sole exception, the only maximal test that told you anything interesting, was the 40-yard dash for running backs. That's it. Every other maximal test told you exactly nothing. There was no correlation. Now, the reason maximal tests so often fail returns us to grit, because what you can't study by definition in a 5-minute test or a 2-hour test are these character traits like grit, which are all about stubbornness and persistence and perseverance. Grit, by definition, is what you demonstrate when you don't think you're being watched. It's what allows you to put in those 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to get good at something so you can invent something relevant and worthwhile. Grit is about the long term. It's not about how you do in a short pop quiz. And in recent years, psychologists, much of the research has been led by Angela Duckworth, who's not too far from here at all, just down the street at Penn in Marty Seligman's Positive Psychology Center. She has pioneered the study of grit, and she first did it at West Point. You see, West Point had this problem where they needed to figure out which kids were going to drop out within the first 6 weeks. For West Point, for the last 50 years, they had had a dropout rate during Beast Barracks of between 5 and 10%. Because West Point doesn't accept transfer students, that was a big problem. So they looked at all sorts of maximal measures, SATs, scores, tests of physical fitness. Nothing predicted retention. They brought in Duckworth. She came up with a simple survey called the Grit-O survey. It takes about 2 minutes to complete. This was the first test West Point had ever administered that predicted retention, that predicted which kids would actually drop out of West Point. The Grit-O survey is a very, very simple thing. You can take it on Angela's website. It asks questions in 2 different domains. The first domain is, how committed are you to this goal? Have you always wanted to go to West Point? Have you always wanted to be a painter, a novelist, a poet, an inventor, a lawyer, whatever it is? Have you always wanted to do this? Is this a goal you take very seriously? And number 2, how do you react to the inevitable frustrations and failures along the way? Are they a sign to you that you should try something new, move into a new domain, or should you double down and try even harder? So that's what the test is all about. And she's shown that this simple survey, the Grit-O survey, doesn't just predict retention at West Point. It also predicts success at the National Spelling Bee. Those 12-year-olds most likely to win, they're not the smartest kids. They don't have the highest IQ scores. They don't get the best grades. They're the grittiest kids. And it helps predict which amateur golfers are going to make the PGA Tour. It helps predict which people end up making the Special Forces, the Army Rangers. It predicts retention in Teach for America. And I would argue that it's an essential component of the creative process too, right? Because creating something new is always going to be hard. It's never going to be easy. If it were easy, it would have been done already. It's always going to involve lots of frustration, lots of failure, lots of edits, lots of disappointment, lots of drafts, lots of iterations. And that's why it takes grit. That's why grit is such an essential component of creative success. Woody Allen has this great quote where he says, creative success is 80% about showing up. Well, grit is what allows you to show up again and again. So far, I've been attempting to describe these two very distinct forms of creativity, which depend on very distinct mental processes in the brain. The more practical lesson, though, is that different kinds of creative problems benefit from different kinds of creative thinking. The question, of course, is how to adjust our thought process to the task at hand. When should we daydream and take warm showers, and when should we drink another cup of coffee? What requires relaxation and what requires grit? The good news is that the human mind, and I shouldn't have said, I think this is very good news. The good news is that the human mind has a natural ability to diagnose our problems, to assess the kind of creativity we need. These assessments have an eloquent name. They're called feelings of knowing, and they occur whenever we suspect that we can find the answer, if only we keep on thinking about the question. One of my favorite examples of these feelings of knowing is when a word's on the tip of our tongue. It's a very annoying mental hiccup. You're walking down the street and you see someone and you know their name. Maybe they're an old friend from high school, an acquaintance on Facebook, who knows. You know their name, but you just can't quite place it. It's on the tip of your tongue. I find this very, very frustrating. But it's also kind of profound, because how do you know their name if you don't actually know it? Right? What convinces you that memory is inside your head in one of those overstuffed file cabinets if you can't actually remember it? Well, here's where feelings of knowing come in handy. When you get a feeling of knowing, that's one of these hunches reminding you to keep on searching for it. Because eventually, after 10 minutes or 20 minutes of searching, you will recover that name. You will find the answer you've been looking for. Now, what scientists have found in the field of creativity is that these feelings of knowing are a remarkably accurate guide when it comes to problem solving. Numerous studies have demonstrated that when it comes to problems that don't require moments of insight, so they don't require these epiphanies from the blue, the mind is very good at assessing the likelihood that a problem can be solved. We can glance at a question and know that the answer is within our reach if only we put in the work. The end result is that we're motivated to stay focused on the challenge. Now, what makes these feelings even more essential is that they come attached with a sense of progress. This was first demonstrated by Janet Metcalfe, a psychologist at Columbia University. She has people working on various creative problems, whether or not they felt like they were getting closer or warmer to the solution. When the subjects were working on problems that were typically solved with insights, they reported no increase in warmth until the insight popped into their head. They went straight from freezing cold to burning hot. There was no feeling of knowing. In contrast, Metcalfe found that problems that didn't require insight were answered only after people reported a gradual increase in warmth, which reflected their own sense of progress. What's impressive about such estimates, of course, is that people were able to assess their closeness to a solution without knowing what the solution was. It is very mysterious. Now, this ability to calculate progress is an important part of the creative process. When we don't feel like we're getting closer to the answer, we've hit the wall, so to speak, like Bob Dylan in May 1965, we probably need an insight. In these instances, we should rely on the right hemisphere, which excels at revealing those remote associations. Focusing on the problem, staying late at the office, chaining ourselves to our desk, that'll be a waste of mental resources. We will stare at our computer screen and repeat our failures. Instead, when we hit the wall, when the problem seems impossible, when that feeling of knowing disappears, we should find a way to relax. The most productive thing we can do is forget about work. However, when these feelings of knowing are telling us that we're getting closer, then we need to keep on struggling. We should continue to pay attention until it hurts, to rely on those muscles of grit. Before long, that feeling of knowing will become actual knowledge. So far, I've been talking about individual creativity, how we invent when we're all alone. But I'd like to spend just the last few minutes talking about group creativity. Creativity as an emergent property of collaborations and teams and companies. And I hope we have time in the Q&A and in the panel discussion to talk about some of these ideas, which I explore in the second half of the book, which I think do undermine and question a lot of the ways we have been doing things. Everything from how we assemble teams to why brainstorming is a terrible, terrible idea. Science says so, I promise. But I'd just like to talk in the last few minutes about a very provocative comparison made by Geoffrey West. He's a theoretical physicist at the Santa Fe Institute. and he spends most of his day data mining cities. So he collects huge data sets from the Census Bureau, from the Patent Office, from governments all across the world to try to figure out what makes cities work, why cities are such engines of innovation, and why some cities are so much more successful than others, why San Jose generates 4 times more patents per capita than Phoenix, on and on and on. He's looking for those interesting correlations. One of my favorite correlations that he's found is that one of the most predictive variables of patents per capita, which cities are the most innovative, and patents per capita, he argues, is the most relevant metric. But one of the most predictive correlations he's found is that the patents per capita in a given city are predicted by the speed, the walking speed of pedestrians. I bet you didn't know that the Census Bureau measures the walking speed of pedestrians all across the country, but that cities in which people walk faster invent more patents per capita. Now, nobody knows what to make. Nobody knows what to make of this. It is a bizarre correlation. It could be an accident, could be sheer coincidence. But what the physicists argue is that people are a bit like particles. That you walk faster, you get more bumps, higher velocity, and eventually all those bumps add up. And every once in a while, one of those bumps, one of those random conversations taking place on the sidewalk while you're waiting in line for a latte, they lead to a good idea. Now, West also makes this very, I think, provocative comparison between cities and companies. He points out that from a certain perspective, cities and companies look very similar, right? They're both large clusters, large agglomerations of people in a fixed physical space. And yet cities and companies exhibit one very interesting difference, which is that cities never die. Cities are indestructible. You can nuke a city, it comes back. You can flood a city, it bounces back. You can terrible earthquake, and we still have San Francisco. Companies, on the other hand, are incredibly fragile and fleeting. The average lifespan of a Fortune 100 company, so a big company, these companies we assume will be around forever, 45 years. 20% of Fortune 500 companies disappear every decade. These are not tiny firms going out of business. These are big firms going out of business. Now, what explains this difference? Why are cities eternal, immortal, and why are companies so fragile and fleeting, so ephemeral? Well, by data mining lots of information about cities and lots of information about companies, West has found an interesting discrepancy, which is that as cities get bigger, as more people move to Philadelphia or New York City, as cities grow in size, everyone in that city becomes more productive. They make more money, they invent more patents, they come up with more trademarks. By every measure you can look at, they become more productive. The exponent, it's called a superlinear scale, so it just goes like this, like a roller coaster going up into the sky. The exponent is 1.15, and that means that as people move into this space, you get more of those bumps. Smart people being around other smart people get even smarter, and that becomes this positive feedback loop. So even more people move there, the city becomes even more productive. This is what's driving urbanization, he argues. This is why urbanization is the great theme of the 21st century. But companies exhibit the opposite trend. As companies get bigger, and of course Wall Street's always saying, get bigger, grow, hire more people, expand your revenue. As companies get bigger, the opposite happens. Companies exhibit sublinear scaling. They can scale to an exponent of 0.9. So as companies get bigger, they make less profit per capita, fewer patents per capita, fewer trademarks per capita. By every metric of productivity, they become less productive as they get bigger. Now, what explains this difference? Of course, over the long run, this sublinear scaling is very, very dangerous because you keep on getting bigger. You've got more sunk costs, but you're coming up with less new ideas, so you become more dependent on your old ideas. And that can work for a while, but eventually you're going to have to start investing in acquisitions, expensive acquisitions for your new ideas. And eventually those old ideas won't work anymore. You will have bled them dry, and that's when you become very fragile. That's when you become vulnerable. That's when you go out of business. So what explains this discrepancy between cities and companies? Why are cities superlinear while companies are sublinear? Well, West argues it's because companies get in the way. They try to micromanage innovation. They erect walls and hierarchies. They tell you which problems to work on. They tell you to brainstorm. They tell you how to work together as a group. They silo knowledge. They insist on vertical interactions. They tell you you can't talk to him and you can't talk to him. They tell you to stare straight ahead at your computer screen and not take naps in the corner and always look productive. And all those attempts to manage the creative process, that ends up inhibiting it, that ends up getting in the way. And that's why West argues the best model we've got for how to work together as a group, how to create a creative team, a creative company, is the city right outside, is the freewheeling, chaotic city. Because when you think about it, a mayor is totally powerless. A mayor can't tell you which problems to work on, who to talk to, where to live. You just go about your day bumping into people. And it's all that human friction, which sometimes can be difficult, isn't always pleasant, but all that human friction is what makes the sparks. In closing, the imagination has always seemed like a magic trick of matter, which is probably why we've always blamed our best ideas on the muses. The good news is that by finally understanding the science of finally understanding where our new ideas come from, we can hopefully have a few more of them. The science of creativity can make us a bit more creative. But we must also be honest. The creative process will never be easy, no matter how much we know about neurons or cities. The science of the imagination doesn't fit neatly on a PowerPoint slide, and it can't be summarized in a subtitle. If creativity were that easy, Bob Dylan wouldn't be so famous. Despite all the clever studies and rigorous experiments, our most essential talent remains our most mysterious. The mystery is this. Although the imagination is inspired by the everyday world, by its flaws and beauties, we are able to see beyond our sources, to imagine things that only exist in the mind. There was nothing, now there is something. It's almost like magic. Thank you so much for listening, for your attention. I look forward to questions. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.